Mary Drewnoski. Dr. Drewnoski received both her master's and PhD from North Carolina State, and that led into a postdoc with feedlot nutrition at Iowa State University. She then moved to Nebraska. Welcome, Mary. We appreciate you being here. She's been here since 2014 with the title Associate Professor and Beef Systems Specialist. And she's part of an interdisciplinary team that evaluates economical systems for integrated crop and livestock production. So, Mary, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and let you talk about your topic at hand.
That sounds great, Brent. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right, excellent. So as Brent mentioned, today I'm really going to talk about selection and management of small cereals for making silage. And really, if we think about winter hardy species that we can plant in the fall and have over winter and allow us to then harvest them in the spring, we don't have a lot of options, as I'm sure you all know. Probably the most common one people think of is cereal rye. Winter wheat's another option, as well as winter triticale. I do want to say that as you think about these different species, I've seen more variability within varieties within a species than even across species. So my first observation and my first thought process was, well, probably like what many of you think, which is that cereal rye, of course, is going to come on the earliest. It's going to get mature the quickest. And then, so that's going to be a positive and a negative, right? The positive is if it comes on earlier, I can get it off earlier, and that means that I can move on to the next crop. A negative, of course, is that you might miss your window. Cereal rye is also a dirty word for many of you who produce wheat for grain, I'm sure. So there's a couple people in the room who are probably looking at me right now with daggers saying, what are you talking about planting rye? But I'm going to talk a little bit about these three species and really talk about some of the most important things you need to be considering as you think about making a small grain silage. So first picture I have here is two varieties of rye. So this is cereal rye. It was planted September 25th down in very far southeast Nebraska. But I wanted to use this picture to demonstrate that, again, variety can have huge implications on how that cereal performs. So in this case, we have a southern rye, which is Elbon rye, versus variety non-stated, which in most of Nebraska, if you are able to purchase a variety non-stated rye, it's going to be a northern rye, which means northern ryes are more winter hardy. Cereal rye that's a southern rye will come out of dormancy earlier. So if you look at this picture side by side, the same field, same planting date, same nutrient application, everything's the same, and you can see huge difference between the maturity in these two. The variety non-stated has no heads out yet, and our Elbon rye is almost fully headed out. So positive and negative, again, remember, it depends on your goals. In this case, if I wanted to be able to harvest earlier, Elbon rye might be a benefit. If I'm a little bit worried about weather, which I will say is probably one of the biggest challenges with harvesting these in the spring, is being able to hit your window when you want to. And I'll show you a little bit about why that is in just a second. Okay, so as we think about planting these winter hardy species and our goal is silage, then we have to think about the fact that we want to get as much yield as we possibly can for the investment, right? And one of the things that has implications on how much silage production you get is when you plant it. So this diagram has really kind of a series of planting dates. So we get our earliest planting date, in this case for where you guys would be at, August 28th versus September 18th versus October 10th. And as long as you plant on September 18th or earlier, you get your maximal spring yield. So you get 100% of the potential yield that you can get, given the other things that might be um, affecting your yield, like, of course, the weather and the nutrients that you may apply to that field. But after that date, after September 18th, we start losing yield. Now, most of you are probably like, well, I have very few fields I can get into that early. Am I saying you can't plant later than that date? No, not at all. In fact, I know many people who plant November 1st and they still harvest for silage. But you have to recognize that the later you plant, the less yield you're going to get off of it. So, being strategic and targeting fields that you can get into the earliest will pay back in terms of being able to get more yield and distributing those costs over more tons. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about maturity stages because maturity has one of the most, it's like it has the greatest impact of all the things that you can do on the forage quality and the tonnage you're going to get. Maturity is key. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about maturity. Okay, so the first stage I'm going to talk about is boot stage. Boot stage is before any heads have come out. And in fact, if you go and look at the plant in the field, what you'll see is this is actually looking at the top leaf and looking just below it. When you're at boot, that seed head is wrapped up in the stem. So you can actually see in this picture, it's actually kind of sticking out just a little bit. There's a little bulge here. That's where the seed head is. That's what we talk about when we're talking about boot. The seed head has not emerged yet, but it's working its way up and it's almost to the top. The next stage I'm going to talk about is anthesis. And anthesis, you might have heard of flowering or bloom. Basically, it's pollinating, and it's pretty easy to tell anthesis because you'll see these little yellow anthers out here, this pollen that's on the plant itself. And so that's anthesis as we talk about it. So it's got its seed head all the way out, and then it's moved on to the next stage, which it's pollinating. And then there's two more stages we're going to talk about. One is milk. And again, this is after anthesis. It's fully headed. And now you have the seed head and the grain in the seed head starting to fill. And if you take a seed out, it'll actually still be green. And when you squeeze it, you'll have this white milky substance come out, which is why it's called milk. So that's kind of the next stage that we look at. And then the last one here is soft dough. So that milky substance is now turned into a doughy substance. And you'll kind of see that oftentimes the seed is a little bit green tinged, but it's turned more yellow than it was. It's not quite all the way, of course, to its full maturity by any means, but you'll start seeing that color change. Okay, so this is actually some data from a trial where we planted rye, triticale, and wheat side by side in Lincoln. And we were really wanting to look at timing of when the plants would hit their various stages, and of course, how the nutritive value would differ among the species. And so really what I wanted to show you is, if you'd asked me my hypothesis, I would have said the rye is going to come on the earliest and it's going to get mature the fastest. And the wheat's going to be the slowest, and triticale is going to be in between, because triticale is, it's a hybrid of the two. So that made sense to me. Well, as usual, I was wrong. That happens a lot for me. That's why we do research, I guess. But if we look here, rye and triticale really did not differ. Now, this was a northern rye, so it is a little bit slower than the southern rye. But you see that they hit boot at about May 19th, and triticale, or wheat, excuse me, was a little bit behind, right? It was 4 days behind. Not a huge difference, but 4 days behind. Then as you look at going through the stages, rye and triticale stayed the same. They just kept plugging along. Interestingly, look at how short these time frames are, 8 to 10 days between each of these phases. So as we start talking about targeting maturity to get the quality that you're looking for, you have 8 to 10 days. But the other interesting thing that I observed is that our wheat actually started out slower but ended more quickly. So it actually had less days in between the phases than the other species. Now, again, I could have selected a different variety and the result may have been different. But the hypothesis that wheat is going to be slower was wrong. The hypothesis that rye is going to move faster than the others is also wrong. But look at our dates. If I'm shooting for boot, I can get it off about mid-May. And if I was shooting, by the way, these were planted October 1st. If I was shooting for soft dough, then it's a whole month later. Okay, so now what do I shoot for? Well, let's talk a minute about moisture content. So if you're used to making corn silage, you're probably used to shooting for somewhere around 32 to 35% dry matter. If you're making small grain silages, especially in later stages, you're going to have a hollow stem, which makes it much harder to pack. So we actually want it to be a little bit higher moisture. Actually, the ideal would be, somewhere 65 to 70% moisture. That would be 30 to 35% dry matter. Okay, so if we look at boot stage, we see that we're quite wet. We're about 80%. So does that mean you can't harvest in boot? No, right? That just means I have to wilt it before I can harvest it. So I have to cut it and I have to wilt it before I can harvest. Same thing with Anthesis. It's still pretty doggone wet. But when I get to milk and even soft dough, I can now start direct harvesting, which is what a lot of people really like about these stages. They can go ahead, go in the field and directly chop. They do not have to lay it down and wilt it first. But I will warn you, looking at soft dough, if it gets too far along, even into soft dough, you can get it too dry. And so that's kind of what happened with this wheat. Even though it was a little bit earlier when we harvested, we probably were on the later side of soft dough, not the earlier side of soft dough. So really that transition from milk to soft dough would be the moisture we're really looking for optimal ensiling. Okay, so now, of course, everybody worries about tonnage. Now this is dry matter tons. And I really wanted to show you, if you harvested boot, you're going to get, about 3 to 4 tons of dry matter. And we can more than double that by waiting to soft dough. So from the standpoint of yield, of course, waiting later, it makes sense. You get more yield. Everybody kind of knows that. But what does it do to quality? So what does it do to nutritive value? Well, if we look at protein content, the earlier you harvest, the higher the crude protein is going to be. That also makes sense. I should tell you that we did apply 60 pounds of nitrogen to these small grains. And unless you have a lot of residual nitrogen in the field, I would suggest you go ahead and apply that much or even more, up to 100 to get the better yields, as well as it does help improve crude protein. The other interesting thing is that when we were doing this particular experiment, we had a 4th treatment, which was triticale, that we were trying to get red clover to grow in. And so we did not fertilize it. So by the way, the red clover was a flop. It could not compete with the triticale. The triticale shaded it out. But we were able to then observe the difference between fertilized and unfertilized. And I think one of the reasons why we often think rye comes on so much quicker is because a lot of the rye we see is in cover crop fields that are not fertilized. And what happened with our triticale that wasn't fertilized, it moved through the maturity stages so much quicker than that was fertilized. So the nitrogen actually helped also extend our phases a little bit, which kind of makes sense, right? Because it increased our yield. It takes a little bit more time to grow. And so it actually was a little bit slower to go through the maturity stages, which can be a huge benefit given those short windows that we have to get it harvested. One rain can set you back a whole stage. Okay, so crude protein content. If we look at boot stage, we were 17 to 18%. We didn't get a sample of the wheat, unfortunately, but you can see there's really no differences among the species. If we start looking at crude protein, they're really very similar. Stage made all of the differences. And when we get down to soft dough, of course, we have the lowest crude protein, but it's still pretty good. 10% crude protein, depending on what you're trying to feed that to, is pretty nice. It's not a protein supplement anymore, which is what boot kind of looks like, but it would still meet any cow needs. You need to feed a little bit more protein for a growing calf, but that's okay because honestly, the type of protein that's in here isn't going to meet a growing calf need, even if you were feeding 17%. So we are going to lose crude protein as we go later. We gain tonnage. What about energy? Okay, so this is a trial actually from near Holdridge, where we were harvesting at different stages, and we had one that was even earlier than boot in this particular one. So that was flag leaf. So that's actually once the flag leaf comes out, but you can't find the seed head up in the top of the stem. And what I really wanted to point you to was here, this TDN, and you see at boot stage, it's 69 TDN. That is really high energy, right? So that's some really good feed. If we go to soft dough, we're down to 60. So this makes you think that as you go in between, remember there's a lot between boot and soft dough, right? So we have this heading, we have the head come out, and then we have the pollination, and then we have, as it starts, that seed starts ripening up to soft dough. Well, this would make you think that there's a linear decline in energy, much like you saw in the protein. So I wanted to show you something because I think it's really important for thinking through our targets. Remember, I told you milk, we start getting the moisture content to be able to direct harvest. That looks pretty good. Yield looks pretty good. Protein looks pretty good. What about energy? So if we look at the energy content of the small cereals as we go through those stages, look at this low point here in energy. That's late head. We gain a little bit by milk, but you can see we're at our lowest energy content, not at the end, but actually here kind of in the middle. And that's because what's happening is if you think about that plant, you have the plant material, so right, the leaf and the stem, and it's maturing. And so as it matures, it gets more lignin, it becomes a little bit more woody, and thus it gets less and less digestible, meaning we get less and less energy until we get to late head. Once we get to late head, you start getting some of the sugar going up into the seed head, and you start trying to form starch, right? Well, that's what we're seeing here is we're seeing a boost in the energy content because we're starting to get starch formation. And so if you're actually targeting harvest, if you really want really high quality, the recommendation is usually shooting for boot to early head. And if you're looking for a balance between quality and tonnage, waiting to soft dough may make the most sense. Now, anybody who's probably tried to harvest small cereals knows that it can get really hard to get in there when you want to, especially if you're waiting on a custom chopper, right? So a lot of times what I would suggest is actually getting geared up and really checking and shooting for milk with the idea that you're probably going to get about half of what you're trying to do harvested at soft dough. It just moves so quickly between milk and soft dough. It's really hard to hit soft dough. Once you get beyond soft dough, not only do we not have any more energy, we've lost the protein, but we've gotten too dry, and it's really, really hard to get it into ensile. In fact, if that happens, probably the best thing you can do is to go in and do something called head chopping, which is basically just taking off about the top 6 inches of the plant. So you're mainly taking off the head and ensiling that. You're making a much denser product. You're going to lower the tonnage considerably, but at least you have something worth harvesting. Otherwise, you have a bunch of straw, which you can't get packed, and you don't have enough moisture to make any use out of that material because you just can't get it ensiled. You're basically going to be harvesting straw and grain. Okay, so I want to take a second and talk about fermentation because your management really will affect the end product. So let's talk just a second here about the phases of fermentation. The first phase is the phase where there's oxygen still in that pile or bunker. And that phase is extremely important because the shorter it is, the less CO2 you're getting produced. Okay, so you can think about CO2, it's carbon, it's dry matter being basically eaten up and then excreted by the bacteria, yeast, and mold, and it's going into the air. You're losing dry matter, right? You don't like that. You also are creating heat, and that heat can degrade proteins, as it says right here. We can start getting ammonia. That's no good. So the way I think about it is if my pile is hot, I'm losing money, right? I'm burning money. Now, this is the first phase where that can happen. The other phase where that happens, right, is when you open that bunker up again, right? So after you've gotten through all the phases, at the end, you start feeding out. As soon as you expose that silage to oxygen, you start this phase all over again. So trying to minimize the amount exposed, of course, is important. But there's a few other things you can do. So how do we get phase one to be short? How do we keep the anaerobic or the oxygen phase short? Well, that's why we talk about packing, right? Packing is extremely important. And with our small cereals, because we often have hollow stems, especially in those later stages, we talk about making sure that you have your chop length very short. 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 an inch would be what we'd recommend. That is smaller than what you would typically do. Corn silage, 1/2 an inch, 3/4 of an inch is probably what you hear the most commonly. So you need to talk to your custom chopper if you're using one and kind of hash that out ahead of time and see if you can talk them into smaller chop, because it will really help you get it packed better and limit this phase. Of course, the other one is making sure you have enough pack tractor weight. And often, if you're using a custom chopper, they have a huge capacity to chop. So they're going to bring in a lot of tonnage per hour. So you need weight, and you probably need more than one tractor to keep up with them. And anything on that tractor that reduces compaction in the field is not going to help you on the silage pile, right? So dualies, not a benefit here. Tracks, those aren't any good. So you actually want to do the opposite of what you want to do in the field. Okay, so phase two is phase where we start getting some acid being produced. In this case, acetic acid, which is vinegar. Acetic acid is good because it is an acid that actually inhibits mold and yeast. And you don't like mold and yeast. So we want that to happen. But what we really want is we want to move into the lactic acid phase as quickly as possible, because that drops the pH more quickly. And that means that we get our silage going into a stable phase, or like the pickled phase, where it is going to be able to sit in that pile and nothing happened to it, right? So how do you get these guys to work for you, right? So lactic acid producing bacteria, we want them, right? Well, if we talk about inoculants, so if you make corn silage, I would say it's probably the majority of people who use a custom harvester, honestly, get an inoculant added. But when you make corn silage actually, the plant itself already has a lot of the bacteria that produce lactic acid already on the plant. And so as long as everything's good in terms of the environment you create, so you get a good pack, so you can limit that oxygen, and you have good moisture content, oftentimes you see very little benefit of adding these homofermentive bacteria, which are the ones that create the lactic acid. Now, with small grain silages, things are a little bit different. You came out of the winter, you're going into the spring, you don't have as much of those bacteria on that plant. So going ahead and inoculating and adding some of those guys is a benefit, because the more of those that are there to create lactic acid, the better. The other thing is that you don't have as much starch. And so with corn silage, you have plenty of food for them. And so they'll grow and multiply really quickly. In this case, we want to add more of them because they're not going to grow and multiply as quickly. And you want them to be scavenging and producing as much lactic acid as possible. So the homofermentive bacteria are good, and they reduce the silage pH more quickly. They get you into that stable phase, and they save more of your dry matter. So they improve dry matter recovery. The other type of bacteria is heterofermentive bacteria. So those guys actually can produce both the acetic and the lactic acid. The benefit of those guys is really about stability once you open that silo back up. They can reduce your losses when you start exposing it to oxygen. Now, not long term, but in the short term. For the first 12 hours of exposure, they reduce how much mold and yeast are growing and multiplying and eating up your feed. So oftentimes what you'll see is, they're working when you stick your hand into the bunk after you fed and your silage isn't hot, right? So if it were me, in the case of small grain silages, I definitely would put in the homofermentive, and I see no negative effect of putting in the heterofermentive. A lot of inoculants will have both, but not all inoculants. And so you kind of want to look and pick and make sure you definitely have the homofermentive guys. You want the lactic acid producing bacteria. Okay, so kind of to wrap this up, what are your targets? Well, unless you have a lot of residual in, go ahead and put on 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you're wanting that balance of yield and quality, probably shooting for very late milk, early doe is a good idea. If you need really high quality feed, then go for boot. Shoot for 65 to 70% moisture. If you're doing that late milk soft doe, that means direct cutting. If you're going for boot, that's probably a 24-hour wilt. Now, one other comment about the cutting process, you can do yourself a favor by cutting a little bit later in the day. And the reason is that if you think about the plant is photosynthesizing when it has sun and it's producing sugar. Overnight, it uses that sugar. And so if you cut in the morning, you're at your lowest sugar amount. The sugar is what really helps you to get that lactic acid being produced. And so it actually really helps you to get the best fermentation possible. It also is great feed value, right? The more of it you can preserve, the better. So if you're direct chopping, you may wait till noon or 2 and start cutting. If you're wilting, you may still do the same thing. That does give you some leeway as well to check early in the morning of that cut material, see where you're at on dry matter, and make a decision whether you're going to let it go a little bit longer or it's ready to go. Make sure you got enough pack tractor weight. The recommendation is 800 pounds of pack tractor weight per ton of forage coming in per hour. I will tell you, almost everybody is underweighted. The other thing is make sure that you're putting on very shallow layers. 4 to 6 inches is the goal, nothing more, because you want to be able to get it packed really well. And with small grain silages, that is one of the hard things to do. And the last one here is probably got half of you rolling your eyes, which is cover the pile. I realize it's a lot of labor to cover a pile. It's also labor to uncover the pile to feed. But with the small grain silages, you don't get as good as shedding. It really does help a lot with the amount of recovery, especially if you're a pile and instead of a bunker. Piles have so much surface area you really lose about the top 3 feet of material that you don't cover. I know everybody looks and says, oh, it's 5, 6, maybe 10 inches, but that's 5, 6, 10 inches of what's left out of the top 3 feet. The other stuff went off as CO2. The other part of that is that black material that you feed out, because everybody does, is so full of mold and yeast that you actually end up decreasing the feed value of the diet, not improving it, because there actually has negative effects on the rumen bacteria. So reducing how much of that black sludge you have pays dividends from that aspect as well. So making that cover and only having an inch to feed off of that black sludge rather than 10 makes a huge difference in the feeding value. And it doesn't show up, all of the change does not show up in the feed value. If you did look at a yeast and mold count, you would see it, but I think it's something that gets underestimated. All right, I think I am done for now. I assume you want to wait to ask questions until the panel?
We can certainly do that unless there's a real quick question from the group. Anything there, Michael?
It looks